I almost forgot. We're now recording. We started chapter 32 last time. Two main things we're trying to understand in this chapter. We're trying to understand what determines what's going to happen to prices, how much inflation we're going to have. And the other thing is what determines what's going to happen to output. What is going to be the rate of growth of real GDP? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? Is it going to have a depression? What are the factors that determine those things? And we're developing the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that you see here in the picture. 3 parts: aggregate demand, long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply. And so to understand this model, those are the 3 things we have to have some understanding of. What does each one represent? And what will cause each to shift? I put up, just a few minutes before class, I put up the new study guide for chapter 32 that I try to lay these things out in as simple as a format as I can give you, because it is complicated. And my guess is you'll have to go through the whole thing once and then go back through it, because you pick up some parts but not other parts. So you have to go back, and it will make more sense to you as you go through it additional times. We have started talking about aggregate demand. We were about to talk about long-run aggregate supply. So we'll start with a quick review of aggregate demand, and then we'll get into long-run aggregate supply. Remember, we said that that aggregate demand curve, what does it show us? Well, first remember the variables on each axis: the growth rate of real GDP and the growth rate of prices, which is the inflation rate. Those are the 2 main things we're trying to understand. The aggregate demand curve shows us combinations of those 2 growth rates that add up to the expected growth rate of spending. Okay? This is a key idea. We're assuming that we know the rate at which spending is going to increase. This aggregate demand, when it has in parentheses here, that means this is aggregate demand based on an assumption that the growth rate of money and the growth rate of velocity will be, the total will be 5%. Okay, so that parenthesis, it doesn't mean we're multiplying something. It's a parenthetical comment. It's saying, here's what aggregate demand is, given that we're assuming the growth rate of the sum of the growth rate of money and velocity is 5%. So every point on that aggregate demand curve is a combination of the inflation rate and the output growth rate, where they add up to a total of 5%. Okay, so, I'm sorry? That's a good thing to tell me. That is an example of what's called the curse of knowledge. When you know something, it's obvious, and it was obvious to me. You could see it because I could see it right here. It's clear as day. But what's clear to one person may be totally dark to somebody else. Just like the people who are Zooming don't have any idea what I'm talking about. Anytime I forget to turn something on, let me know. Way too many things for my mind to keep up with. So, yeah, thank you for letting me know. What we were saying, now that you can see the graph, the aggregate demand curve, each point on that aggregate demand curve is each and every point is a particular growth rate of real GDP and growth rate of prices. So for every point on that curve, it is a point where these two growth rates add up to 5%. Okay? That's a key thing to remember about aggregate demand. So every other point on that curve is a combination of growth rates where the total is 5%. We're very interested in how fast GDP is increasing and how fast prices are increasing. The aggregate demand curve shows us what the total of those two growth rates will be. But if all we have is aggregate demand, we don't know what either one of them will be, because we could be up here, we could be here, we could be anywhere. So we got to have aggregate demand, got to have aggregate supply. We've got to know about spending. That's what aggregate demand is telling us about. And we have to know about production. That's what aggregate supply will tell us about. Remember, don't be thrown by the arrow, and sometimes it's hard to tell if that's an arrow, that it's supposed to be an arrow there. It just means the growth rate of whatever is below the arrow. We've said that the equation for aggregate demand is this equation here, that the inflation rate is just the sum of the growth rate of the money supply plus the growth rate of velocity minus the growth rate of real output. Where did that come from? It came from this equation, which is just the dynamic version of the equation of exchange, which we started out with here, M times V equals P times Y. Okay? Notice with that simple version, you're multiplying the variables. But when you convert into growth rates, you're adding the growth rates. Okay? We talked a little bit about what can cause the curve to shift. Okay? And we said really two causes. If you have a change in the growth rate of the money supply, curve will shift, or you have a change in the growth rate of velocity. That will also shift the curve. What can change velocity? Well, we talked about what real GDP is. At any point in time, it's consumption spending plus investment spending plus government purchases plus net exports. We said that anytime you have a change in the growth rate of any of those components, that's going to change velocity. Okay? It's probably not exactly clear why you have that relationship, but that's the way it is. This is one of those things, just trust me, that velocity will increase if you have an increase in the growth rate of any of these. The growth rate of velocity will decrease if you have a decrease in the growth rate of any of these. And we can say if the growth rate of the money supply increases, aggregate demand is going to increase, a rightward shift. If you have an increase in the growth rate of velocity, the same thing. So the two key things for aggregate demand, money growth, velocity growth, either of those increases, aggregate demand increases. If either of those decrease, aggregate demand decreases. Okay? And here we started out with the original demand curve, aggregate demand, which was based on an assumption that spending was going to grow at 5%. Okay? If something happens and we're told now, no, it's not going to grow at 5%, it's going to grow faster, it's going to grow at 7%, what's that going to do? That's going to shift the whole curve up and to the right. That's an increase in aggregate demand. Could be because money growth went up, could be because the growth rate of velocity went up. Either way, they both will shift aggregate demand to the right. And keep in mind, you might think, well, who cares if it shifts? Just a curve. Now, remember, aggregate demand is going to have a key impact on what happens to the growth rate of prices and outputs. So if output increases faster, then the economy is going to do better. Living standards are going to go up. If aggregate demand decreases, then the growth rate of output is going to go down. We can have a recession or even a depression. So connect the shift of the curve, which doesn't seem very exciting, to the effect on millions of people that occurs when you have a shift of this curve. Events which can change the growth rate of spending components. I think we talked about this before. This is just a review. If consumers become more confident about the future, they think their incomes are more secure, they're going to spend more money. If they become more worried about the future, they're going to cut back on their spending. Think about what happened back in March, where suddenly people are told you can't go to work. Well, for a lot of them, their incomes went down. With less income, they're going to cut back on spending. For people who got significant assistance from the government, their income may not have gone down, but almost certainly they were concerned what's going to happen. How long am I going to get this extra government assistance? So you would expect people would cut back on their spending and would save more. And the data shows that is exactly what people did. Profit outlook for businesses. We said that how much businesses will choose to invest depends on how profitable they think it will be. And when you have an event that causes businesses to think investment's not going to be as profitable, they're going to cut back on investment. When you have an increase in uncertainty, businesses are going to cut back on investment. Now, just think about, what would you do if you've got $200 million that you could use however you want, and you're thinking about building a new factory, and then something really unexpected happens and there's a lot of uncertainty? Do you just say, well, I'll go ahead and spend that 200 million? Who cares if I lose it? No, you're probably going to think, I don't know what's going to happen now. I'm going to not invest in that new factory. I'm going to wait until there's more certainty about what's going to happen in the future. Taxes affect both consumers and businesses. Taxes go up, spending is going to go down. So that's going to be higher taxes will reduce the growth rate of velocity, will decrease aggregate demand. And most of these are pretty self-explanatory. If something is going to lead to more spending, then it's going to lead to an increase in velocity, aggregate demand is going to go up. If it's going to lead to less spending, then the growth rate of velocity is going to go down, and aggregate demand is going to decrease. Changes in the growth rate of velocity tend to be temporary. People cut back on their spending at one point in time, but the growth rate will tend to go back to where it was before. And so that means that when you have a decrease in the growth rate of velocity, it will shift aggregate demand to the left, but it will tend to go back to where it was before. We'll see the implications of that a little bit later on. All right, the long run aggregate supply curve. Notice we're switching from the demand side, from spending to production. How much will producers choose to produce? That's what aggregate supply is focusing on. And we are talking about the long run. Let's talk about supply first, then we'll talk about what we mean by the long run. Basic idea, it shows the economy's potential growth rates as determined by the real factors of production available. Think back to chapter 28, where we had the Solow growth model. Solow is just the name of the guy who came up with it, remember we had looked something like this, where we had the amount of capital on the horizontal axis, we had output on the vertical axis, and it was a curve that looked something like that. As we got more capital, output went up. That's the Solow growth model. And remember, we had a production function. We said that output is a function of, it depends on how much capital we have, physical capital, depends on how much our human capital is. They listed that as EL. Depends on how much labor we have, the size of the labor force, but also how much education people have. Okay? And then also A, which stood for ideas or technology. The better technology we get, the more output we're going to be able to produce. These are the real factors that determine how much output producers will be able to produce. And so the long run aggregate supply curve is showing us the rate at which our ability to produce will change. And it's going to depend on these real variables. It doesn't depend on how much people want to buy. It depends on how much producers are able to produce. If our capital stock is going up at a fast rate, if our technology is improving at a high rate, then our growth rate is going to be high. Okay? So when we talk about real factors, these are the things we're talking about. Important to note, there is no relationship between inflation and the economy's ability to grow in the long run. Right? If we have the technology and the human capital and the physical capital to grow at a rate of 3%, and the Federal Reserve starts increasing the money supply a lot faster, so we got a whole lot more output or a whole lot more money, that doesn't mean we can produce more output. Right? You can't produce new cars with money. Okay? So money has no long-run impact on how much we're able to produce. Inflation has no long-run impact on the amount of output we're able to produce. So our long-run aggregate supply curve really is pretty simple. That vertical curve is just saying the rate at which real GDP can grow is totally independent of the inflation rate. Okay? It's saying there's no relationship at all. If the inflation rate is 0%, then we're going to be here and we will be at the Solow growth rate. We have generally assumed that that's about 3%. Okay? Point like this is saying that if we have 5% inflation, then the growth rate of real GDP will still be exactly the same. We'll be at the the potential or the solo growth rate. If we have 15% inflation, then we're going to be up here, but at the same growth rate. Okay? It's a really important thing to grasp. The price level, the inflation rate do not affect our ability to produce in the long run. Okay? Question about that? All right, well, now we need to ask, okay, but what do we mean by the long run? And the book gives you a very good definition. I think most textbooks don't really give a good definition, or one that's as good as this one. Okay? Definition of the long run: a period of time that is long enough that full price adjustment has occurred. Remember, think back to chapter 3 and chapter 4, supply and demand. When you have a change in a market, usually that'll shift the demand curve or that'll shift the supply curve, and it will lead to a change in prices. Remember when we, back in those chapters, we would start out with an equilibrium. And the price level would be, we'd be in equilibrium. And then we would introduce some change that would occur, change in demand or change in supply. When we'd have that change, then we would get a new equilibrium. Okay. And in chapter 3 and chapter 4, we didn't worry about, well, how long does it take to get from the original equilibrium to the new equilibrium? Okay, because that's a difficult question to answer. It won't always be the same amount of time. Okay, well, when we're talking about short run and long run, we're talking about that period of time that's required to get from the original equilibrium price to the new equilibrium price. And when we talk about the long run, we're simply saying what's going to happen over a period of time that is long enough for the full price adjustment to occur. Okay? When we talk about the short run, we just mean a period of time that isn't long enough for the full price adjustment to occur. Okay? So note, long run does not necessarily imply that it is a long time. Okay? That adjustment in some markets, in some time periods, may be very fast. Other times, maybe in a matter of a few seconds. Whereas in other situations, it may take much longer, okay? Potentially days, weeks, even months. Okay? And we're not going to go into the question of, well, what are the factors that will determine that length? Okay? That's a complication that's interesting, but we don't have to go into that. We're just going to distinguish between what happens over a period of time that is long enough for this full adjustment to occur, and what happens during a period of time where that full adjustment has not occurred. Okay? And when we talk about the long run aggregate supply, we're saying don't worry about how long it takes for adjustment. We just want to know, once that adjustment has occurred, where are we going to be? And the long run conclusion is pretty simple, that the inflation rate, the price level, has no effect on the rate at which output will grow if we are thinking in long run terms. Okay? So that's why you're getting that vertical curve, because a vertical curve always means the value of the horizontal variable is completely independent of the value on the vertical axis. Okay? Okay, to review, an economy's potential growth rate is called solo growth, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Which one is it? It's the solo growth rate, right? It's like so many things in economics, sometimes we have multiple terms that mean the same thing. Long run growth rate, solo growth rate, potential growth rate mean exactly the same thing. So just keep that in mind. And on the exam, if there's a term and you're not entirely sure what it means, you can always ask me, and I may be able to say, I'm not just going to give you the name, but if you said, is solo, it says solo growth rate, is that the same as potential growth rate? I could say yes. Okay. So it's always free to ask questions on the exam. Sometime I may have to say I can't tell you that, but there's no cost in doing that. Okay, shifts in the long run aggregate supply curve. Notice every time we introduce a curve, eventually we're going to talk about what can cause it to shift. And these shifts are caused by what are called real shocks. That's an important term you want to remember. And real shocks refer to anything that affects the potential growth of real GDP. Okay? Anything that shifts the long run aggregate supply curve, we're going to call that a real shock. And this is pretty straightforward. These are real shocks are things where it's obvious it's going to affect how much output gets produced. If we have real unusually good weather, or unusually bad weather, we have 3 hurricanes, that's going to have an effect on how much output we're able to produce. That will tend to reduce the growth rate. And so if the long run aggregate supply curve had been here, let's say 3%, and we have a year where we have unusually bad weather, we're not going to get as much output. The growth rate of output is going to be lower. So maybe it shifts over here to 1%. Just very straightforward. Things that will cause producers to be able to produce less, that would be a negative real shock. Things that would enable the producers to produce more would be a positive real shock. If we have wars, we have a war where people get killed, where factories get blown up and destroyed, well, obviously that's going to reduce our ability to produce. So a war that is a negative real shock. Labor strikes. If you have lots of unions going on strike, they're not working. Well, if they're not working, they're not producing. If they're not producing, you're not going to get as much output. So that is a negative real shock. New technologies. Obviously, you don't adopt a new technology unless it's beneficial. So if it's a new technology, it is beneficial, and that would be a positive real shock, because it's real in the sense that this is something that is a factor of production, and because of this change, we're going to be able to produce more output. It's not just people want to buy more, it's that producers are now able to produce more output. Sudden changes in the supplies of important resources such as oil. Lots of recessions have been caused by events related to the oil industry, because oil is such an important input into production of lots and lots of things. These are also called productivity shocks. Okay? So, long-run shocks, real shocks, productivity shocks mean exactly the same thing. Okay? And here you see the graph. A positive shock results in a higher growth rate. So this would be the positive shock. It was at 3%. The positive shock may be better increase in the growth in technology. Now we get 7% growth. If you have a negative shock, then that means we can't produce as much, output doesn't grow as fast, and that means that the curve is going to shift to the left. We're going to get a lower rate of growth of real GDP. Okay? And this just summarizes negative shocks versus positive shocks. You want to understand each one of those, but the most important thing is when you're dealing with questions, dealing with this material, draw a graph. I can't tell you how many people I see who insist on doing this kind of thing in their head. They don't draw it out. And there are a lot of questions that are very simple if you just use the graph. If you don't use the graph, then you are just assuming that you are smart enough to work it out on your own without using the model we have developed. That's not a good thing to do. When I think through a problem, I draw a graph because I've been doing this for long enough to know how easy it is to make a mistake, even after you've been doing it for a long time. So draw a graph. And then when you're drawing the graph, remember, if it's a negative shock, if it's a real shock, that means the long-run average supply curve is shifting. If it's a negative real shock, it's shifting to the left. If it's a positive real shock, it is shifting to the right. Okay. Higher business taxes will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left, to the right, or will not shift the long-run AS. Okay. This one's a little tricky because higher business taxes will affect aggregate demand, as we already talked about, but they will also affect aggregate supply. Okay? Because when you have a higher taxes that on business, that affects incentives. And if you raise taxes, then there's less incentive to produce. So firms are going to produce less. The growth rate is going to be lower. So here the correct answer would be A, will shift long-run aggregate supply to the left, which means lower taxes would improve the incentive to, or increase the incentive to produce, and that would shift long-run aggregate supply to the right. There's one example from India. India, their economy has been largely agricultural based. That was certainly true for the US back in the 19th century. Today, it's agriculture is still important, but as a percentage of the whole economy, it's dramatically less important. So it's interesting to look at India. Agriculture is the largest contributor to their output. When their agricultural sector has problems, the whole economy is going to have problems. And if you look here, you can see the green is the growth rate of agricultural output. Blue is the deviation of rainfall from the average. So you can see when they have more rainfall than normal, then output goes up. When they have less, output goes down. Over here, same thing, except this is not just looking at agricultural output, it's looking at the growth rate of all of their GDP. And you can see a pretty close connection between the two. So that would be an example of an economy where they are subject to some very significant real shocks from the weather. Okay? And that in this country, if we have, I think even the 3 hurricanes we've had, it has a huge effect in Louisiana, but for the U.S. as a whole, okay, GDP isn't even going to go down noticeably as a result of those changes. Think about back in 2005 with Katrina, devastating real shock to that area. But if you look at the GDP numbers for the US, it really didn't make much of a dent in it. So there are some factors that are very significant for the local area, but they don't have that much effect on the larger economy. All right, long-run equilibrium is reached when prices have fully adjusted to a shock. So at any time there's a shock, a change that occurs, then prices have to adjust. The question is, how long does it take for that adjustment to occur? Well, all we're going to say is when we talk about long-run equilibrium, we mean a period that has been long enough for that full adjustment to occur. But here, for the first time, we're going to really put the two curves together. We've got aggregate demand, we've got long-run aggregate supply. Let's look at this carefully. Our aggregate demand curve, we would say this aggregate demand curve is drawn based on an assumption that spending is going to grow at 10% per year. Okay? That's the assumption that's being made by this graph. That means that the inflation rate and the growth rate of real output, if you add those together, it's going to be 10%. And looking just at aggregate demand, we could have 10% inflation and no growth in output. We could have 7% inflation and 3% growth. We could have 10% growth in real GDP and no inflation. Okay? Aggregate demand curve by itself doesn't tell us what either growth rate is going to be. But if we have aggregate demand and we have the long-run average supply curve, okay, we know what the rate of real GDP growth is going to be. Well, if we know that the total is going to be 10, and if we know that the growth rate of real output is going to be 3, then what can we conclude? What's the inflation rate going to be? If the total is going to be 10 and real GDP growth is going to be 3, then we know that inflation is going to be 7%. So by putting the two together, we're able to determine what both of these are going to be in the long run. Okay? Doesn't tell us what's going to be the immediate effect if some shock hits the economy. What this tells us is what the effect will be after enough time has passed for prices to fully adjust to the changes. Okay, we talked about business cycles before. Just means business fluctuations around the long run trend. Remember, we said if you put time on this axis and real GDP on this axis, the long run trend is upward, about 3% per year. But if you look at the actual path of GDP, it does something like that. It increases faster than 3%. It decreases at some periods. The business fluctuations is referring to these short-run fluctuations around the long-term trend. And as we've said, we don't like these fluctuations because when output is going down, we're not producing as much. That means living standards will be lower in general for people. Plus, when we go into recession and output is going down, what's going up? What are people losing? They're losing jobs, and that's especially painful and traumatic for them. So we don't like these fluctuations. One of the reasons we want to try to understand what causes them is so we can figure out what government potentially can do. Well, we want to figure out, is the government doing anything that is causing these fluctuations? If so, then we want it to stop. And we want to know when there are fluctuations, what can the government do to offset them or make them less severe, less painful than they otherwise would be. We can now say that you can think of these fluctuations as being the result of one of two things. Using our model, when we have a recession, it's going to be at the result of something we've called real shocks or demand shocks. Okay? So two categories of causes for the business cycle. Real shocks, they shift the long and aggregate supply curve. Demand shocks shift aggregate demand. And for both, if it's shifting to the right, that's a positive shock. If it's shifting to the left, it is a negative shock. Okay? To understand how these shocks, well, especially to understand demand shocks, okay, we have to now talk about the short run aggregate supply curve, which you've seen some graphs that had that curve in it that I haven't explained where it's coming from and how it works. So that's what we need to look at now. Question at this point. Okay, the short run aggregate supply curve. To talk about this, we have to talk about John Maynard Keynes. Certainly one of the most important economists of the 20th century. A lot of people would say that he was, remember we talked about Adam Smith, we said he's the father of economics. Well, John Maynard Keynes would probably be the father of modern macroeconomics. He was a very respected British economist, the early part of the 20th century. He was writing at the time of the Depression, and obviously things were not going well. It wasn't just the United States, the whole world was, almost the whole world was in depression. Started roughly the early 1930s. Most people would say it lasted at least until World War II started in 1941. Was extremely severe, had periods of time where unemployment was over 25%. So means 1 out of 4 people nationwide who was willing to work, who was looking for a job, could not find work. And I mean, you now know how traumatic a sudden increase in unemployment can be, because back in March and April, the unemployment rate went from 3.5% to almost 15%. Okay? But now we're 9 months after that, and it's come way down. Okay? It's been very traumatic, but it went way up, and then it came down, or it's coming down very quickly. In the Depression, it didn't go up to 15%, it went up to 25%. And it didn't come down quickly. It started up in roughly 1930, and it was up in 31 and 32 and 33 and 34 and 35 and 36, 37, through the whole decade. Things were not good. And it's really hard to get a sense of how disturbing that was to people, because it really seemed like something had just gone wrong. Something was wrong with the world, that it worked one way before, and now things just seem to be broken. And Keynes was pretty much a traditional classical economist, such as Adam Smith. And when we think of Adam Smith, what do we think of? What's the phrase we remember? The invisible hand. The idea that something happens and prices will adjust. If everybody's doing what seems to be best for them, it's going to work out. We're going to get to equilibrium. Things are going to be okay. But then we had the 1930s, where it doesn't seem like things are going to be okay. It seems like something is really wrong. And Keynes was looking at the economy at that point, and basically he said, there's something wrong with the classical model. He said there's something wrong with, there's an inherent flaw in a market economy. And it's not surprising that we're getting a depression. Okay? And in the book that he wrote, which is called The General Theory, you do need to remember the general theory. You don't have to remember the whole title. The whole title is The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Just remember the general theory, that's enough. Written or published in 1936. And in that book, which was extremely influential, it was very widely read. It changed people's thinking. It changed not just economists' thinking, it changed politicians' thinking. In that book, he basically said the classical model doesn't work. A market economy has an inherent flaw in it. That's the bad news. But he said there's good news. And the good news is that I've identified the problem. And the basic problem was that you can have periods of time in which there's not enough spending. And the really good news is there's a way to deal with that problem. If consumers won't spend enough, and if businesses won't spend enough, who can spend more? The government. Okay? So, in a very small nutshell, he said, he presented a model which said there's a problem, there may not be enough spending, but there's a solution. We can get out of this. People were literally depressed because the future just looked bleak. Like, well, we've been in depression for 5, 6, 7 years. No sign it's getting any better. People were depressed. The future looked bleak. Economists were depressed. And Keynes comes along and says, I have the solution. The future doesn't have to be bleak. We just have to get government to spend enough money, and that can get us out of the depression, and we can avoid depressions in the future because now we know what causes depressions. And this book was widely read and was accepted as this is the solution. People are excited now that possibility that we have a vaccine for COVID-19. Well, economists were a lot more excited about the general theory than about a vaccine for COVID-19 because the future had looked bleak to them, and now they thought, we've got this tool. We just have to get government to follow the right policy. We have to get government to spend enough money, and we will come out of the depression. Unemployment will come down. People will have hope. He was extremely influential. Don't take that to mean he was correct. He was extremely influential. And his ideas really give us the basis for this short run aggregate supply curve. Okay? Let's see, this is Keynes. If you ever forget how to pronounce that word, just remember what Keynes said. He said he would tell people Keynes, it rhymes with brains. And he thought that he was a pretty smart guy, and he liked the fact that his name rhymed with brains. To understand the short run aggregate supply curve is a little complicated. So just try to follow each part of this, and then once we get to the end of it, you'll probably need to go back and think through it again. Inflation, actual inflation and expected inflation is going to be an important part of understanding the short run aggregate supply curve. When actual inflation equals expected inflation, it means when people, for example, if people think there's going to be 1% inflation, and then it turns out that there was 1% inflation, then real growth will be at the long run potential growth rate. That's what we're seeing here. Okay. Now this graph puts in the whole short run aggregate supply curve, but all we're talking about at this point is the red dot there. Okay. SRAS stands for the short run aggregate supply curve. Remember, when you have something in parentheses, it means the short run aggregate supply curve based on or assuming what is in the parentheses. Remember, the pi represents what? The inflation rate. E represents expected. So what that means is this is the short run aggregate supply curve if people are expecting 2% inflation. Okay. And that would be pretty much like today, okay, because we generally have inflation about 2% or a little bit less. So that's probably roughly what people think will happen in the future. If we are here, then the actual inflation rate is 2%. People are expecting 2%. Okay? So this isn't a shock. It's not a surprise to anybody. They were expecting 2%. Inflation was 2%. What's going to happen? We are going to be at the long run growth rate because nothing surprising has happened. Prices are already in their long run equilibrium. Okay? There's no further adjustment that needs to take place. Okay? So that's that point. Now we need to ask, well, what if actual inflation exceeds expected inflation? What's going to happen? That would be what if we're at a point like that? We've already said we're assuming that the people are expecting 2% inflation. If we're at point B, then the actual inflation rate is 4%. People thought inflation was going to be 2, but we're getting more inflation than people expected. Why is that going to affect how much output will be produced? Well, think about it like this. Wage rates, we're assuming, are going to be set by labor contracts. When you're working, you sign a contract. Of course, it varies from, you don't always have a contract, but this is the way we're going to think about it. In many situations, you have labor contracts, specify what the wage rate is going to be over the coming year. If people are expecting 2% inflation, then they're going to want a 2% cost of living wage increase to compensate them for that inflation that they expect. Okay? So in the situation we're talking about here, where actual inflation is greater than expected, okay, that means you've got, and corresponding to what we have at this point B, okay, you've got wage rates that are going to be going up at 2%, but the actual inflation rate is 4%. Okay? Think about how this affects businesses. Businesses are trying to make profit. So their wage costs are going to go up by 2%. But if we're having 4% inflation, that means that on average, businesses are able to change the prices they charge by 4%. So if you're running a business and you're having to pay your workers 2% more than the previous year, but you're getting prices from your customers that have gone up by 4%, the costs have gone up by 2%, your prices, your revenues have gone up by 4%, what does that do to your profit? Your revenue has gone up by 4, your costs have gone up by 2. This is a good thing from the firm's perspective. If your revenues are growing up faster than your cost, then your profit margins are going up. And if it's becoming more profitable to produce the product, you have a greater incentive to produce the product. That is what is happening when we move from A to B. Okay? We're starting out again with the assumption that everybody's expecting 2% inflation. So wages are going to be going up by 2%. Okay? But for whatever reason, here it says assume there's an unexpected increase in money growth. So the Fed starts increasing the money supply faster. That shifts aggregate demand to the right. And you can see, looks like the new equilibrium is going to be here. Okay. That means inflation is going to be 4%. Everybody was expecting 2% inflation, but we're getting 4% inflation. From the perspective of the business, the costs have gone up by 2%. Their revenue is going to go up by 4%. So profit margins are higher than before. So firms are willing to have an incentive to produce more. That's why we're getting this increase in the growth rate of real GDP. We move from this point to this point. Notice what's happened. Because of the increase in actual inflation, we're getting an increase in the growth rate of real GDP. Okay? We're getting a positive link there. Now, when we talked about the long-run average supply curve, we made a big point of saying that in the long run, an increase in inflation will not affect how much output will be produced. But here we're saying, and this is largely based on ideas that came from Keynes and his students after him. Here we're saying in the short run, okay, in the period of time where prices haven't fully adjusted, when we get an increase in inflation, that can give us an increase in the growth rate of real GDP. So we're getting a direct relationship between inflation and the growth rate of output. And so that's giving us this upward sloping curve from A to B. Now let's consider the other possibility. We said that if people are expecting 2% inflation and that's what actually happens, then we'll be right here. We'll be on long-run average supply. We'll be at the long-run growth rate of real GDP. If we have a monetary shock where the Fed's increasing the money supply faster, then we get unexpected inflation, and in the short run, we get an increase in output. But now we're going to say, well, what about the third possibility? What if the actual inflation rate isn't equal to the expected? What if it's not greater than expected? What if actual inflation is actually less than was expected? Okay. What is going to happen under those conditions? Okay. Well, we're assuming that people are expecting 2% inflation. So that means that wages are going to increase workers are going to ask for a 2% cost of living wage increase. That's going to be in their contract. Okay? That means that from the employer's perspective, his costs are going to go up by 2%. But what if it turns out that actual inflation is less than that? Okay? What if the firms aren't able to raise their prices by 2%? Right? Actually, well, they changed the graph on me here. Let's, now we're assuming that people are expecting 7% inflation, which means when they sign their contracts, they demand a 7% cost of living wage increase. So that means that employers in the coming year have to pay wages that are 7% higher than before. Now, the employers, they don't want to pay those higher wages, right? But if everybody's expecting 7% inflation, competition for workers will force them to offer those higher wage rates. But here we're saying once we get into the coming period, and if we've had a decrease in aggregate demand, if there's not as much spending as we had expected, and it turns out that the actual inflation rate is only 6%, think about that from the perspective of the employer, the firm. Their wage costs have gone up by 7%. They thought that they would be able to raise their output prices by 7%, but they're not able to do it. Okay? Their output prices are going up by only 6%, which means because of this unexpected decrease in inflation, the firm's costs are going up faster than their revenues. What does that imply about profit margins? Profit margins are going to be lower. And if profit margins are lower, they have less incentive to produce. And so in the short run, the growth rate of real output declines. Okay? We started here. We would have stayed there if the inflation rate had been what everybody was expecting. Okay? But if it turns out that we get less inflation than people were expecting, then that's bad for businesses. That reduces profit margins. And so firms have an incentive to cut back on output. So here we see that this point and this point show us what happens on the supply side when we have less inflation than people were expecting. When we looked at the points up here, that showed us what happened when we had more inflation in the short run than people were expecting. And so all three of these points are indicating that in the short run, the supply curve is going to be upward sloping, which means in the short run, inflation does have an impact on the rate at which output will increase. Doesn't in the long run, but it does in the short run. Okay, so just to review this, we assume that we started at this point. People were expecting 7% inflation, but, and that would have happened if the growth rate of spending had remained at 10%. Okay? But we're assuming something has happened that has caused the growth rate of spending to drop to 5%. Okay? Maybe the Fed cut back on the growth rate of the money supply. Maybe the velocity of money went down because consumers cut back on their spending or businesses cut back on investment. You remember, we got those four components. Whatever, if one of those things changed, it caused the growth rate of spending to go from 10% down to 5%, then aggregate demand decreases. And in the short run, we move from here to there. Note inflation goes down, but the growth rate of real GDP goes down. And we go into a recession, people are going to lose their jobs, unemployment goes up. Are we going to stay there forever? Adam Smith would say no. Adam Smith would say, given enough time, prices will adjust and we'll get back to that long-run equilibrium. And here is where we see that long-run adjustment. This is the same as before. Started here, we moved to there, gone into a recession with high unemployment in the short run. Okay? What's causing the problem? The problem is because in the short run, there's not enough time for all prices to adjust. Keynes emphasized wages. He said that wages are sticky. Okay? If something is sticky, it's hard to get it to change. Okay? He argued that workers don't like their wage rates to go down. They resist. There may be a change in the market that lowers the equilibrium wage, but workers are going to be reluctant to accept that and affirm. They may think, well, the wage rate, we can offer a lower wage rate, but they may think that maybe this isn't a good idea because if we cut wages, then workers are going to be angry and they're not going to be very productive. So the wage rate may not go down very quickly. And as a result of that, that means we're going to have a short run period during which wages are at the wrong level. And that's what's happening as we move from A to B. We move into a recession because of a decrease in aggregate demand. This would be a demand shock. Okay? Are we going to be there forever? No. Because eventually, remember, the reason we have this problem is because people are expecting a level of inflation that is above the actual inflation rate. The problem is that expectations are wrong. Okay? And the key insight here is that when we are in a situation like this, eventually expectations will adjust. If everybody's expecting 7% inflation for next year, but we only get 6%, okay, what are they going to expect the following year? Well, that's hard to know, but if we get 6% inflation next year and 6% inflation next, if inflation is consistently at this new lower level, eventually people are going to start to expect 6% inflation. And the key thing, really, this is the kind of the final increments or adjustment to our model. When expectations change, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift. Okay? Here we started with this curve. We're going to end up with a new curve that has shifted down. And the reason is because when people start to expect less inflation, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift down. Here, we're not finished with that. We'll come back to it just a second. Here, this shows we went through the analysis showing that if the actual inflation rate was equal to the expected, we would be at the potential growth rate. If we have more inflation than was expected, we'll be above the potential growth rate. If we have less inflation than was expected, then we'll be below the potential growth rate. So this is the derivation of that upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. It is upward sloping because of the positive relationship between actual inflation and the growth rate of output. The position of the short run aggregate supply curve is anchored by the expected rate of inflation. What does that mean? We'll look at the graph. When the expected inflation rate is 2%, where does the aggregate supply curve intersect with the long run aggregate supply? Right here at 2%. Okay? When people expect 2% inflation, then the intersection with the long run curve is going to be at 2% inflation. When people expect 7% inflation, where's the intersection with the long run aggregate supply curve? It's at 7% inflation. Okay? So the short run average supply curve will shift anytime people change their expectations about inflation. So that means that if people start to expect more inflation, the short run average supply curve is going to gradually shift up. If people start to expect less inflation, then the short run average supply curve is going to shift down. Here we see if we are at B, just think through what happens. At B, the actual inflation rate is 4%. But at B, we're on this short run AS, people are expecting 2% inflation. So if we're at B, people are expecting, we're getting more inflation than people are expecting. And over time, people will start to expect more inflation. And that causes the short run curve to shift up. Okay? We eventually end up there. We end up back at potential output. The same thing applies if we're at a point like B. We're not going to stay there forever. We're going to end up again back at the long run growth rate for real GDP. That is, we've covered a whole lot of complicated stuff. So go back through it, think about it. We will go back through this and review it next time. So this isn't something we're just gonna, I won't assume that you got it the first time. We will be reviewing this on Tuesday of next week. Okay. We're out of time. Let me know if you have questions. Test number 3. We're going to push that to Tuesday, not next week, but the following week. Yeah, we will do that. And I'll specify exactly how far it will go. I'll send something out over the weekend. But it would definitely be most of Chapter 30, Chapter 31, Chapter 32. Those will be the main things that will be.
So not the 17th. It says that on.
No, we're gonna move it to. I forget the day, but it will be a week from this coming Tuesday.
The 24th.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think so. I'll put up an announcement just to confirm it.
We are going to put the grade on Moodle for the notes from exam 2.
I'll probably get that up over the weekend.
And I know that the chapter 30 was kind of messed up, but I put all my notes for chapter 30 because I finished it for exam 2.
Okay, that's
so it's
fine.
all on that one.
Okay, that